On October 17, 1777, nearly 6,000 soldiers from one of the finest armies on earth stood in a muddy New York field and handed their swords over to American militiamen. To understand how shocking that sight was, you have to look at where the American cause stood just months earlier. George Washington's troops were freezing in the hills of New Jersey. Desertions were rampant, and enlistment contracts were running out. The entire rebellion was financially bankrupt. This is a $5 bill of continental currency issued by Congress. Notice the crude printing and worn texture. It was paper money backed by almost nothing, and the colonists themselves barely trusted it. Without basic supplies or hard currency, the revolution was rapidly collapsing under its own weight, which makes the massive British defeat later that year an astonishing act of imperial self-sabotage. The scheme that doomed them was drawn up in the elegant rooms of Whitehall in London. The logic was clean. Send a massive army down from Canada to control the New York waterways, physically slicing the radical New England colonies completely off from the rest of the continent. This map lays out the invasion corridor. Look at the top right panel showing Lake Champlain, a path south. Two other forces would push east through the Mohawk Valley and north from New York City, converging in the center panel to lock down the Hudson River. The man who lobbied for the primary command was Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. The troops called him Gentleman Johnny. He packed 130 heavy cannons and an endless baggage train filled with his personal wine cellar and a portable writing desk. He expected to march this pristine, rigidly disciplined European force, trained for open-field linear warfare, straight through millions of acres of raw, untamed terrain. At first, it looked like a stroll. Burgoyne easily captured the mighty Fort Ticonderoga without firing a shot. King George celebrated in London, and American morale hit absolute rock bottom. But that effortless early victory fed their arrogance. The British High Command assumed a campaign drawn up perfectly on paper would survive the brutal reality of the American frontier. Instead of taking the fast, logistically simple water route down Lake George, Burgoyne decided to march his army 23 miles overland through dense virgin forest. The American commander, General Philip Schuyler, answered with a vicious scorched-earth strategy. His men felled enormous trees across every possible trail, destroying bridges and damming creeks. A march that should have taken 3 days turned into 3 weeks of crawling through swamps. While Burgoyne hacked through the mud, his support vanished. The Western force under St. Leger was ambushed and retreated to Canada. And the Southern force under General Howe? He loaded his men onto ships and sailed for Philadelphia instead. With his reinforcements gone, a prudent commander would have pulled back. Burgoyne crossed the Hudson River anyway, severing his own line of retreat and stranding his isolated army deep in enemy territory. The vast wilderness, combined with terrible imperial communication, inverted the entire campaign. The heavily armed British hunters were now the prey. By mid-September, Burgoyne's shrinking, starving force reached Bemis Heights. Waiting for them were thousands of American militiamen, heavily fortified and outnumbering the British 2-1. When Burgoyne probed the American lines at Freeman's farm, the fighting was savage. Hidden in the trees, American long riflemen methodically assassinated British officers and artillerymen from distances the European troops thought were impossible. Meanwhile, the most aggressive tactician in the American camp, Benedict Arnold, had been relieved of command after a shouting match with his superior. He spent weeks pacing his tent in a bitter, helpless fury. But on October 7th, Arnold snapped. Defying direct orders, he galloped onto the battlefield, rallying troops and leading a reckless, magnetic assault right into the fortified British right flank. He collapsed the defenses just before a musket ball shattered his leg. The British lines crumbled. When a sniper's bullet mortally wounded Brigadier General Simon Fraser, one of Burgoyne's most capable commanders, the last thread of military cohesion vanished. A rigid, aristocratic war machine simply could not survive the chaotic, improvisational aggression of furious frontiersmen and a rogue commander who refused to lose. Surrounded, freezing in the autumn lane, and completely out of food and ammunition, Burgoyne finally admitted reality. He formally surrendered his nearly 6,000 remaining men to the Americans. The news hit Europe like a thunderclap. In Paris, Benjamin Franklin had been begging the French court for open support. Now, he had proof that an entire British field army could be captured. The calculation changed overnight. France signed a formal military alliance, flooding the American effort with gold, thousands of troops, and a massive naval fleet that immediately challenged British dominance across the Atlantic. Back in London, John Burgoyne returned on parole. He was stripped of his commands and spent the rest of his life desperately trying to explain to Parliament how he lost an army in the New York woods. Benedict Arnold's fate was far darker. Crippled, deeply in debt, and watching his rivals claim the glory for the victory he secured, his resentment curdled. 3 years later, he attempted to sell out his country to the British. Today, on the Saratoga battlefield, there is a monument dedicated to his heroism. It is a simple stone carving of his wounded boot. It bears no name. The Whitehall Plan was an elegant, arrogant theory that shattered on the friction of reality. By trying to casually march through the wilderness, the British Empire broke its own grip on the continent and guaranteed the birth of the United States.